Wow, that was great to sing. Isn't that great to sing? I enjoyed it, and I want one of those drums. I want. That was nice. So anyway, it's already February, right? Which means you've forgotten all about Christmas. There's the faint glimmer of spring break in the future, but it seems almost too far away to do any good. This is sort of the wasteland. Sort of the wasteland. It's hard right now. It is, but you're doing great. Yeah, that's good. Well, I have an assignment. Last week, the lesson was, and when I am weak, I'm strong. And so this week, he thought he would bring out somebody really weak and see if they could be strong. Was that the idea, Carrie? Something like that. Okay, so that's good. That lesson, when I'm weak, I'm strong lesson, is one of my very favorite lessons because it's got so much hope in it. Tonight, my assignment, given to me by my fearless leader, is that I would talk about, and maybe this is good, maybe it's just right in this minute, love your enemies. Love your enemies. Is it up there? Oh, that's good. I spared every expense to get these high-priced visuals in place. I hope all 5 of them work. Nothing explodes. It doesn't do that. But this whole idea of love your enemies, this is taken from the Sermon on the Mount, and in the place of the upside-down kingdom where Jesus comes in and tells people things that when he tells them, they go, "What? Blessed are the poor? The poor aren't blessed. Blessed are the mourning. Blessed are when you're sad. What? That's you're hungry and thirsty for righteousness. No." Jesus starts off with the Beatitudes, and we always go, "Now let's just read the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes are just wonderful." But when people heard the Beatitudes, they thought that's all wrong. I mean, it sounds nice. Blessed are the... And he picks the wrong ones. It was, blessed are the full. Blessed are the folks who've never lost anybody to death. Blessed are the people who are the boss, not the meek. Blessed are the... And Jesus gets all the blessed are those wrong. And then he goes into what I call the you've heard it saids. You've heard it said. And this may be quoting the Bible, the Old Testament, or quoting someone's interpretation of it. You've heard it said, don't murder. Everybody goes, yeah, that's right. We're kind of down on murder. He says, I'm telling you, don't hate. Wait a minute. You're kind of moving in on me here. And so he goes through these things, the you've heard it saids. And he finally comes to this that says, you've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Now let's just stop right there, because now that makes sense. Love your neighbor, love your friends, love the people who are close to you, love the people that have already declared they already like you, love them. And then your enemy, who is your enemy, should be treated like your enemy. And the way you treat your enemy is that you despise your enemy. You hate your enemy. That's what they've gone to all that trouble to be your enemy, after all. They perhaps should get what they have been working so hard for. Have you ever had anybody around you that you thought they were kind of working on being your enemy? I've got one nerve and you're on it. Yep. But he says, not only am I going to tell you something different? I'm telling you, love your enemies. Now, he doesn't go back and say, love your neighbors. He figures you're going to do that. He says, love your enemies. And pray for those who persecute you so you can be like God, like your Father in heaven. It's almost like Jesus came into the world and he said, okay, this is something we know about in heaven. We know what it's like to have enemies. And we know what it's like to have our representatives persecuted. We know what it was like for Abraham and Moses, and we know what it was like for Joshua. We know what it was like for Samuel. We know what it was like for David. We know what it was like for Elisha and Elijah. We know what it was like. We've been watching this for years. And God has continued to let y'all be here. He's blessed you with life, given you rains and squirrels and stuff like that. God's continued to bless you. So He says, I want you to do what God has already been doing pretty much since the world started. I want you to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Okay, now you have to divide a lesson up into pieces. Otherwise it just all comes out like a big bowl of lumpy mashed potatoes. And so I've at least divided the mashed potatoes up into 3 parts. And the first part is right there. That you have to deal, first of all, Bill Munger is just a genius back there, I tell you, making all this work. The first thing that you do in loving your enemies, let's just try to figure out where some of our enemies are. But where are some of our enemies? And so let's talk about the enemies that are the out yonder enemies. Well, a lot of us grow up aware that there are some forces around us that it's okay to consider the enemy, the out there enemy. When I was growing up, everyone knew that Russia and Red China and the communists and the Red Threat and the Iron Curtain and the Bamboo Curtain, that all of that was the enemy. And you had considerable parts of American information or disinformation or whatever was going on reinforcing all of the time that you had these enemies. I had people close to me who had strong racial biases. And so that anybody who wasn't at least as white and freckled as they were was sort of your enemy. Your enemy. Don't move. I'm going to have a little talk here with Sam. Sam, when I was 4 years old, my brother and I were in a car with one of my relatives, and he said, I got to go in here, boys. Stay in this car, because if you get out, the Mexicans will cut your ears off. That's pretty terrible, isn't it? Yep. I just had to talk to him about that. That's horrible. Crazy. But you're an enemy. And so in various ways, you can have ethnic enemies, you can have political enemies, you can have economic enemies. The place where Annette and I grew up a lot of our life, almost all of her life, there was mines. There were mines, and there were the unions, and there was management. And there were vicious strikes that would last months. And it would be the union people versus the management people. And when you went to school and you sat with your kids, the kids in your school during a strike, you knew from their perspective who the enemy was. They didn't know any names. They didn't know any faces, but they knew enemy. And so you have enemy out here, political, economic, racial, ethnic, enemy. I grew up in a church. that thought it was pretty right because, well, you know, that's just how being right is. But it tended to demonize other churches. Churches that didn't cross the T's and dot the I's exactly the same way it did. So you had enemy churches. Now these people are out in their own summer camp singing Kumbaya, holding hands in the dark, doing all that, making s'mores out to the glory of God, just like you were. But because they were different, in some of their doctrine, they're the enemy. And so you have the enemies out there. We could add to that. We haven't even gotten to rival universities yet. Poor Kerry over there is a walking contradiction. He doesn't like himself most of the time because of where he's been seen and the people he's hung around with, you know. And so, in fact, I was at lunch today with some people. They said, yeah, it's okay to be in Austin and like A&M, but you better not go to A&M and like Austin. That was the way they laid it out. I went, really? Is that? So you have these enemies afar. And you could go through your own life and ask yourself about the enemies that are out there. And one of the things that does is it can raise you up in an atmosphere of fear. Of fear, on the one hand, fear. Or on the other hand, an atmosphere of superiority, arrogance, better than. The fact that you have these enemies out there either scare you or give you a feeling of dominance, or maybe both. When I was a little kid, we're better than the Russians. We're going to go to the Olympics and beat them in the 100-yard dash, and that'll prove our economic theory is better than theirs. It was always a big deal. Who's going to win the Olympics? Because that proves you're a better country. You know, and out there, you know, this little guy from Ethiopia is running really fast. And he goes, does this prove anything? I don't know. But on the one hand, you were pretty sure you were better than all the Russians. And also knew at the same time, from the drills that you did in your schoolroom, you knew that in 30 minutes, the world could end. That when you heard that certain siren, and the word was that the missiles are launched, because Russia and the United States had what was called MAD policy, mutually assured destruction, you knew that when the mushroom clouds sprouted over the American landscape, it was done. And so all the time I was growing up, from about 1961 or 2 until 85 or 6, we lived in a world that could end in 30 minutes. All of us did. And so you have arrogance and fear. And that's the world you can live in. And Jesus says, why don't you try loving your enemies? Even though the television tells you, hate the Russians, why don't you just pray for the Russians and love them? Why don't you pray for China and love it? Why don't you pray for Al-Qaeda? Who do you think anybody needs it more? Pray for A&M. I mean, I hate to say Al-Qaeda and A&M at the same time. I don't really mean that. I really don't mean that. I really don't. This becomes an international incident that can't cross the Brazos anymore. I didn't mean that. I don't mean it like that. But I mean that Jesus says, stop worrying about your enemies and pray for them. As far as it depends on you, love them and pray for them. And get the temptation to arrogance and fear out of your system. That old thing that says, I know I'm better than a Baptist, but I'm kind of afraid of them. Let it go. Why should your life be marked and scarred by these forces that are so out there and at a distance you can't do anything about any of them anyway? So turn them over to the Lord in His divine hand. Forgive. Pray. All right? Well, then there could be a second. Intimate enemies. There was a book like this that was about working your way through difficult marriage. It was called the intimate enemy. Not enemy. The intimate enemy. The mate that's difficult. But this is a different kind of thing. This is not a faceless enemy. This is not just a power or a bias or a prejudice or a this or that. This is not a social movement. This kind of enemy has a face and a name, and you know the face and you know the name, and that enemy knows you. That's different. Jesus has, there's a whole piece here about that first point that I was going to talk about. Jesus and the Romans and Jesus and the Sadducees and the Pharisees and all that. I think some of those were kind of his enemies afar. But Jesus also had these intimate enemies, intimate people who were his troublemakers. And oddly enough, there's two stories that I think are interesting. One is the story when he goes to Nazareth and reads. And in Luke chapter 4, he reads from Isaiah 61, says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because He's anointed me, and He's called me to preach good news." And he goes all the way down through that piece, and he sits down and says, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your presence." And then he goes on and talks about how that he's come, and then they say, "Well, would you do some miracles here?" And he says, do you remember the fact that when there was a big famine in Israel, that God didn't send Elijah to anybody in Israel? He sent him to a widow up in Sidon. And do you remember that even though there were lepers in Israel, do you remember that he sent Elisha over to be with Naaman from Syria? Do you remember? And they got mad at him, and in a minute they are so angry at Jesus that they pushed him out of the synagogue, down the street, and to the brink of a hill, and their idea is they're going to throw him off and kill him. So they've gone from, "Welcome home. We're so glad you're here. We've watched you grow up right here. Jesus, we loved you. We loved your papa. He made me a little couch about the backyard there. He was such a good carpenter, I tell you. We buried Uncle John in the coffin he made. It was so good, we thought about keeping it." And here, you're just glad you're here. We know your mama. We know your brothers. Come in and would you read? Would you talk to us? You disappointed them. You disappointed them. You disappointed the people that knew you. You're not living up to their expectations. And suddenly they've turned and they're chasing you down the street. And the people that you were in Little League with their boys, those dads and some of those boys that you grew up with, are chasing you down the street and ready to pitch you over into the valley and watch you die. In Mark chapter 3, Jesus is out teaching, and Mary, his mom, and his brothers and sisters show up, and says, Jesus entered a house, a crowd gathered, and when his family heard about him, they went to take charge of him, for his family said, "He's out of his mind." Really? Mary? Mary, you remember the angel? Remember the promise? Remember Elizabeth? Remember the angels in high? Remember the wise men? Remember? But Jesus' ministry is so upside down that even his mother thinks this isn't right. So they come to take him away. They come to take him away. Now those are intimate enemies. So let me go way out on a limb here and suggest that some of you have some people who are in your family, in your network of friends, in the people that you've gone to church with or went to school with, that you have had some people who have been against you. I'll tell this little story. Annette won't mind. She may mind. But I asked Annette to marry me. It was good. Great day. I called my dad and said, I asked Annette to marry me, and she said yes. You did what? And my dad hung up the phone, got in the car, and drove 4.5 hours to knock on my door at 6 o'clock in the morning the next day to tell me I was nuts. Now, Annette, being the kind and gentle, pray for your enemies and the person, she says, we were perhaps a little nuts. We were 19, no visible form of support, things like jobs, or there were some things like that my dad could have been. But he had known Annette since she was 5 years old. And I was expecting high fives. I was expecting my dad to say, you have looked into the world, and across the broad sweep of the world, you have gone back like the children of Abraham to the home country and have found the best woman in Carlsbad, New Mexico, the middle of that desert where somebody has, watered your camels and all that stuff that they did. I was expecting high fives. I didn't get them. Didn't get them for a while. Now, my mom, Monday was their 63rd anniversary. Now, as they've revised history, they have always loved her and have always thought I was brilliant. So, well, they've always loved you. Being brilliant is not good. So there's a place where when you hear Jesus saying, forgive your enemies, you may say, my Father? Forgive my Father? Forgive my mother? Forgive my brother? My sister? My aunt? My uncle? My boss? Forgive the woman or the man who works right next to me and has all these years who treated me like dirt? Forgive these people. I know these people. I know what they're like. I know them. And Jesus says, forgive them and pray for them. It's the only way out. Now, we could go into a lot of things. There's a difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. There's a difference between forgiveness and making everything all nice. But at least in your own mind, having to be the one to keep the score, you can let it go. Having the one to hold the hurt inside, you can let it go. And say, before God and in the name of Jesus, I am letting this go. One thing forgiveness does is it lets what that other person's done stop hurting you. It's almost a way of saying, by the power of God, I'm going to exert the power that love gives to break the chain of toxicity, poisoning, of hurt that is in this relationship. I'm going to forgive it. Now, briefly, I'm kind of going on too long here, but Third one. This is my favorite one. The enemy under your hat. I'm glad you're wearing a hat. That's good, yeah. See? Because now everybody go, oh, that's what he... Now, it's not, he's the enemy, the guy under the hat. You're not the enemy. But have you ever, let's see, oh, he's his own worst enemy. Oh, he shot himself in the foot. Yeah, we got these things. One of the ones that came out of Leon Lett, self-tackleization. You remember that? Yeah. Oh, yeah. So you have these ways that we talk about. I'm just a screw up. I'm just not worth anything. I just always. And then there's something that goes after that. I just always. And maybe it's something that somebody's told you about yourself, or maybe something that in your worst moments you know about yourself. That my anger gets me, my lust gets me, my mouth always goes off, my whatever. Do you know what it is to have one of those? And you've been dealing with this in yourself so long, and it makes you angry at yourself. And you know, I've been around folks. It's just so hurtful. I had a girl come in my office, and y'all know about this stuff. And she said, I cut myself. I said, why do you cut yourself? She said, because when I see the blood, I just feel better. When I feel that pain, when I see that blood, I deserve that. I deserve that. And so what I would like to do is just wrap this verse over you and around you and say that the love of God in Christ allows you to forgive yourself and to pray for yourself. To forgive that broken part of you, to forgive that part of you that doesn't get. And you keep taking chemistry and your brain just doesn't think in valence electrons. They don't even do those anymore. Right? Oh good, nobody knows. Do they still do valence electrons? Ah, good. I still know something. You keep trying to run your head against it and you just hate yourself. You just got to forgive yourself. Forgive yourself. You've had somebody has told you something about yourself, that you're worthless, you'll never amount to anything. But you've started believing that. You become your own enemy. Somewhere in the love of God, we've got to accept that God loves us so much that we can love ourselves a little. You hear it? So, in this time, you've got the world out there. And for some people, their world is defined by the nameless, faceless enemies. Let it go. For some of us, we have known our enemies. We know their eyes. We know their ways. We know how they punch our buttons and pull our strings. We know. Forgive and pray. Sometimes it may be in a different order. It may need to be pray and forgive. And for yourself. For yourself, made in the image of God. For yourself, beloved by Jesus on the cross and in the morning of the resurrection. For yourself, as Max Lucado says, if God had your picture, He would put it on His refrigerator. It's true. It's true. May it be so for us. It's really upside down. It's the way we get to live. May God bless us all.